Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're fulfilling a listener's request and telling Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë, published in the year 1847. A woman tells her own life, from an unloved child who belonged to no one, to a woman who belongs to herself and can love precisely for that reason. A story about cold houses and a warm heart, about a dark secret beneath one roof and a voice that calls across mountains and moors. Make yourself comfortable, breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried into an English manor house on a dreary November day. There was no thinking of walks that day. The November rain stood in veils over the garden of Gateshead Hall, and I was glad of it, for I feared the cold walks home more than sitting indoors. My name was Jane Eyre. I was 10 years old, and I lived as an orphan in the house of my aunt, Mrs. Reed, who did not love me. My parents had died when I was not yet a year old, and my Uncle Reed, my mother's brother, had taken me in as an infant. On his deathbed, he had drawn from his wife the promise to keep me like a child of her own. She kept the promise to the letter. I was housed, I was fed, I was clothed. Loved? I was not. Her 3 children, Eliza, Georgiana, and John, were permitted everything. I was permitted nothing. And 14-year-old John let me feel his power whenever it pleased him. That afternoon I had crept behind the curtain of the window seat with a book into my only hiding place when John found me. He tore the book from my hand, for everything in the house was his, as he said, the books too, and I was a charity child and had no right to them. Then he threw the book at my head, and I fell against the edge of the door and bled. And then something happened that frightened me most of all. For the first time in my life, I fought back. I flew at him, blind with rage over years of humiliation, and to this day I do not know what my hands did. His screaming brought the whole house running, and as it goes in such houses, it was not the son who was punished. It was I. Mrs. Reed ordered me shut into the Red Room. The Red Room was the coldest, stillest chamber of the house, with dark red curtains and a high bed like a catafalque, and it was the room in which my Uncle Reed had died. No child of the house entered it willingly. I was pushed in, the key was turned, and I sat in the twilight and saw in the mirror a small, pale ghost that was myself. As the last light faded, I thought I saw a gleam glide across the wall, and terror closed over me. The ghost of my uncle, I thought, is coming to me. I screamed. I shook the door. I begged. Mrs. Reed opened it, looked at me, and locked me back into the darkness. Then my senses left me. I woke in the nursery, and at my bed sat Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary, a kindly man who treated me when the servants were ill. For the children of the house, the physician came. He spoke with me, calm and grave, and asked me things no one had ever asked me, whether I was unhappy, and why. And it was he who afterward made Mrs. Reed the suggestion that turned my life. The child should be sent to a school. Mrs. Reed seized on it, glad to be rid of me, and so, on a January morning, a visitor came to Gateshead. Mr. Brocklehurst, the head of the charity school, Lowood, a tall, black man like a pillar of stone. Mrs. Reed commended me to him with the words that I was deceitful and given to lying, and that at Lowood they should keep a watchful eye on me. So the child's bad name traveled ahead of it before it packed its trunk. On a dark winter morning, I left Gateshead, alone in the coach, 50 miles, and no one waved after me. Lowood was a gray, severe house behind walls, and the first months there were harder than anything I had known. Burnt food, too little of it, icy dormitories, endless devotions. And over it all the spirit of Mr. Brocklehurst, who preached that the girls must be raised in humility and privation, while his own daughters came to visit in velvet and feathers. Once he stood me on a stool before the whole school and declared me a liar before 80 girls, and forbade everyone to associate with me. That I survived this hour I owed to two people. The one was the superintendent, Miss Temple, young, just, and warm-hearted, who heard me out, believed my account, inquired of Mr. Lloyd for the truth, and solemnly cleared me before the school of every charge. The other was a girl of 13, Helen Burns. Helen was the strangest and wisest being I have ever met. She was ceaselessly scolded and punished by one of the teachers, often unjustly, and bore it all with a patience I did not comprehend. I told her I could not do that. I would have to strike back at whoever struck me. Helen smiled and said, life was too short to fill it with rancor and revenge. I did not understand her then, but I loved her. In the spring, the fever came to Lowood. The damp valley, the hunger, the cold, the sickness found a rich harvest. The school became a lazaret, and many girls died. But Helen did not die of the fever. She died of the consumption that had long been working in her. On a night in June, I stole to her bed, crept under the covers to her, and we spoke softly. And she said she was not afraid. She was only going home. I fell asleep at her side. When I was carried away in the morning, Helen was still sleeping, I thought. She had died in my arms. The fever did one good thing. It woke the country. The conditions at Lowood were investigated. Mr. Brocklehurst lost his sole rule, and the school became a better place. I stayed there 8 years, 6 as a pupil, 2 as a teacher. Then Miss Temple married and went away, and with her went what had held me. I was 18 years old, and in me there woke a longing for the world, for life, for something I did not yet know. I placed an advertisement in the newspaper. A young teacher seeks a position as a governess, and the answer that came bore a name that was to become my destiny. Thornfield Hall. Thornfield Hall lay in the heart of England, an old grey manor with battlements on the roof, crows in the trees, and wide, still fields all around. I was received by Mrs. Fairfax, a small, friendly old lady in black, whom at first I took for the mistress of the house, and who was only the housekeeper. The master, she explained to me, was Mr. Rochester, but he was seldom at home. He traveled much. One often did not see him for months. My pupil was a little French girl of 8, Adele, Mr. Rochester's ward, a chattering, vain, lovable child who dearly loved to sing and dance and to tell of Paris. Life at Thornfield was quiet, orderly, and good to me, and yet in those first months I sometimes climbed to the flat roof of the house and looked over the fields to the horizon and wished I could see what lay beyond it. One thing struck me early. From the topmost floor where the servants lived, I sometimes heard a laugh that did not sound like a laugh. Deep, hard, joyless. A sound that crept through the corridors. Grace Poole, said Mrs. Fairfax, a seamstress who worked up there. An odd person. I thought little of it. On a January evening, I walked to Hay, the village on the hill, to carry a letter to the post. It was freezing. The way lay lonely, and the moon was just rising when I rested on a stile. Then I heard hoofbeats. A great black dog ran past. Then came the rider, a heavy man on a tall horse, and on the icy path the animal slipped and fell, and the rider with it. I ran up and offered my help. The man was about 40, broad-shouldered, with a dark face and stern features, and he had sprained his foot and was of a temper like the weather. He asked curtly who I was and from where, and when I said I was the governess of Thornfield Hall, he looked at me a moment strangely. Then he leaned on my shoulder, limped to his horse, mounted, and rode off without much thanks. I went home and thought I had helped a surly stranger. But in the house all the lights were burning, and Mrs. Fairfax hurried toward me. The master had arrived. Mr. Rochester. He had sprained his foot. The horse had fallen on the way from hay. So I met Edward Rochester for the first time, on an icy road in the moonlight, without knowing who he was, and he leaned on me. Later, I often thought that in that, everything was already there. With the master, life came into the house, and a strange master he was. Mr. Rochester often had me called to him in the evenings into the fireside room and spoke with me as no one had ever spoken with me. Not as with a subordinate, but as with a mind that held its own against his. He was moody, imperious, unpredictable. He could wound and in the next sentence say something that was like a window into a dark, wide room. He had seen much and found little peace. So much I soon understood, and somewhere in his life lay something buried that he carried. I contradicted him when I was of another mind, and he seemed to enjoy it like fresh air. Out of the evenings grew weeks, and I noticed what was happening to me long before I gave it a name. Then came the night that could have ended everything. I woke from a sound in the corridor, a murmur, a laugh. That laugh. Before Mr. Rochester's door, smoke was creeping. I rushed in. The curtains of his bed were in flames, and he slept the sleep of one drugged. I seized the wash basin, the jug. I poured water over bed and sleeper until he woke, spluttering, and together we smothered the fire. And then he did something strange. He forbade me to wake anyone. He himself went up to the topmost floor, stayed away a long while, and came back with an explanation that was none. Grace Poole, the seamstress, had probably been careless with a candle in her sleep. It would be dealt with. But Grace Poole stayed in the house, sewed the next morning with steady hands, and no one dismissed her. I did not understand it. What I understood that night was something else, the way he held my hand before he let me go, and how he said he had known I would one day do him some good. I did not sleep again that night. But as though he had frightened himself, he traveled off in the morning, to neighbors for weeks, and when he came back, he did not come alone. A troop of fine guests moved into Thornfield, ladies in silk, gentlemen with loud voices, and among them, before all the rest, Miss Blanche Ingram. Tall, dark, magnificent, a beauty as if out of a frame, and the whole house whispered that the master would marry her. Evening after evening I sat by command in the drawing-room in my quiet corner and watched how she shone and how he let it happen. She treated me like air, and governesses in general like a plague, and Mr. Rochester sometimes looked over at me, out of the midst of the others' laughter, with a look I did not want to explain to myself. I told myself I had no right to pain. I was poor, small, and plain, and he was a gentleman of an old house. But little can be said to the heart. Into those weeks full of guests fell an incident that I understood only much later. A stranger arrived, a Mr. Mason from the West Indies, a handsome, soft man with a restless glance, and I saw how Mr. Rochester lost his color for a breath at the sound of this name. On the night that followed, a scream rang through the house, from the topmost floor, so that the guests rushed into the corridors. Mr. Rochester calmed them all with a firm voice. A servant girl had had a bad dream, but when the house slept again, he came for me. Above, In a room I had never entered sat Mason, pale, bleeding, bitten, and stabbed by a hand I did not see. But behind a locked door next to it, something rumbled and growled. I bandaged the stranger at Mr. Rochester's bidding and watched over him in silence until, before dawn, the physician came and secretly took him away, and I asked no questions, because I saw how my master carried a burden he could show to no one. Grace Poole, it was said again. Even then, I no longer entirely believed it. Soon afterward, the past called me. From Gateshead came word that Mrs. Reed lay dying and asked for me. I traveled there and sat at the bed of the woman who had never loved me, and with her last strength, she confessed to me a wrong. 3 years before, a brother of my father had written, Jane Eyre from Madeira, childless and wealthy, who had wished to take me in and make me his heir. But she had answered him that Jane Eyre was dead. So her hatred had worked on my life even across the years. I forgave her, as well as a person can forgive, and she died without taking my hand. When I returned to Thornfield, it was high summer, the guests were gone, and over the land lay that stillness in which everything is decided. On an evening in the garden, under the great chestnut tree, he caught me. He spoke of his marriage as if to test me, and that I should then have to leave Thornfield for Ireland, perhaps. And I suddenly heard myself speaking as I had never spoken, that my heart was breaking, that I had a soul as he did, and that before God I was his equal, poor and small as I was. Then he drew me to him and said that Blanche Ingram had never been in question. She had been a performance to make me jealous. It was me he wanted, me alone, his equal, his companion. Whether I would marry him. I asked whether he meant it in earnest, and he swore it. And I said yes. That night a thunderstorm rose, and the lightning struck the old chestnut tree and split it to the root. I could have read it as a sign. I did not want to. The weeks until the wedding flew by, and I lived in a happiness I never entirely trusted. He wanted to hang me with silk and jewels. I resisted, laughing. I remained the governess who earned her small wage until I should bear his name. But 2 nights before the day, something happened that I dared to tell him only the morning after. I woke, and in my room stood a figure, a tall woman with thick, dark hair, who took my bridal veil from its hook, threw it over her own head, and regarded herself in the mirror. A face I will never forget, bloated and dark, with bloodshot eyes. Then she tore the veil in two, trampled the halves underfoot, and bent over my bed, close over me, until my senses failed. "A dream," said Mr. Rochester. "Half dream, half Grace Poole," and he promised to explain everything to me one day, in a year and a day. But the torn veil truly lay on the carpet in the morning. Then came the wedding morning. We stood in the little church before the clergyman. The banns had been read, and when the question came whether anyone knew of an impediment, a voice spoke from the back of the nave. "The marriage cannot take place." A lawyer from London stepped forward, and beside him, Mr. Mason. And there, before the altar, was spoken aloud what Thornfield concealed in its topmost floor. Edward Rochester was married. For 15 years. To Bertha Mason, the sister of the witness. The marriage made in Jamaica. Rochester denied nothing more. He led us all, the clergyman, the lawyer, Mason, and me, up to Thornfield, to the 3rd floor, through the door behind which it had always rumbled. There, in a room without windows, by a lamp, dwelt a creature that ran on all fours, growled, and clutched at its gray hair. Bertha Rochester. Mad for many years, from a family in which madness was inherited, which had been concealed from the young bridegroom back then. Grace Poole was nothing but her paid keeper, and all the riddles of the years, the laugh, the fire, the bite, the night with the veil, had dwelt up here. Bertha flew at her husband, and he wrestled her down without striking her, and bound her arms, and as he did, he looked at us with a face I will not describe. What came then was the longest day of my life. He implored me to stay, not as his wife, that was no longer possible, but as his beloved, in the South, in France, where no one knew us. He told me everything. The deceived youth, the years of hell, the search for one human being. And I loved him more than ever. But in me, something rose up that was stronger. If I now threw myself away, I was lost forever, for him too. In the night, before daybreak, I left Thornfield Hall, on foot, with a few shillings, without a farewell. Reader, it was the hardest thing I have ever done. The coach I could afford carried me 2 days and set me down at a crossroads in the midst of the northern moorland, and there I noticed that I had forgotten my bundle in the carriage. I possessed nothing more than the dress on my body. 2 days and 2 nights I wandered over the heath, slept in the open, begged for bread in a village and received little, and on the 3rd evening, in the rain, at the end of my strength, I saw far off across the moor a light. I dragged myself toward it and collapsed at the door of a long gray house. They carried me in. The house was called Moor House, and those who lived in it became my brother and sisters, Diana and Mary Rivers, 2 clever, warm-hearted sisters who worked as governesses, and their brother, St. John, the young parson of the parish. I called myself Jane Elliot, for, found, I did not wish to be. They asked no further. They nursed me back to health, and St. John procured me work, the little village school of Morton, 20 farm girls, a cottage with it. I taught, I lived quietly, and slowly I came back to strength. Only at night, in dreams, I was at Thornfield. St. John Rivers was a handsome man with a face as if of marble, and like marble, too, was what he called his heart. He had a single thought, to become a missionary in India, to give his life as an instrument. An inclination toward the beautiful Rosamond Oliver, who loved him, he cut out of himself like a fault. By a chance, my real name stood on a slip of paper that I carelessly left lying. He discovered who I was, and with that, a knot came loose of which I had suspected nothing. My uncle John Eyre in Madeira had died and left me his whole fortune, £20,000. And more than that, this very John Eyre was also the uncle of the Rivers siblings. The 3 people who had gathered me up from the doorstep were my own cousins. I had a family. What I did seemed to me a matter of course. I divided the inheritance into 4 equal parts, against all protest, and for the first time in my life, I was no longer poor, and richer still in the other thing. But then St. John began his work on me. He had recognized my toughness, my seriousness, my capacity for work, and he decided that I belonged at his side as a missionary's wife. He did not woo, he demanded. I should marry him and go with him to India, not out of love. Love, he said, was not necessary. We served a higher purpose. And so relentless was the quiet pressure of this man, week after week, that I wavered. India would have killed me, that I knew, but it almost seemed to me a matter of indifference. On an evening, I stood at the window and was as near to a yes as never before. It happened. Through the stillness, a voice called my name. Jane! 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 3 times, distinct, a voice full of pain that I would have known among 1,000. It came not from the room and not from the garden. It came across the mountains. It was Edward Rochester's voice, and I answered it aloud into the night. "I am coming. Wait for me." The morning after next, I sat in the coach. 36 hours I traveled, and the last stretch I walked on foot across the fields with a pounding heart, until between the trees the battlements of Thornfield must appear. They did not appear. I stood before a blackened ruin. Thornfield Hall had burned down, the windows empty hollows, the walls sooty against the sky, and over the rubble the grass was already growing. In the inn of the village I learned everything. In the autumn after my disappearance, Bertha Rochester had one night set the house on fire, the governess's bed first, and had then climbed to the roof. Mr. Rochester had led all the servants out of the burning house, and had then, before the eyes of the people, climbed up once more to fetch his wife. She stood on the parapet, screamed and jumped before he reached her, and shattered on the pavement. He himself came out last, and then the staircase collapsed, and they pulled him from the ruins. Alive, but marked. One hand was crushed and had to be taken from him, and his eyesight was gone. Blind and alone, said the innkeeper, he now lived at Ferndean, an old hunting lodge deep in the forest, with only 2 old servants, and let no one near him. That same evening I stood before Ferndean. I did not knock. I entered, as one enters one's own life, took from old John the tray with the candles and the water glass, and carried it myself into the dark room where he sat by the fire, the great old dog Pilot at his feet. The dog recognized me first and sprang up at me whining. Then the voice from the armchair asked who was there, and I answered. What was spoken in that hour I will not set down in full. He believed at first in a dream, then in a ghost, and held my hand fast with both his hands, as though I might dissolve. He would not let me go again, and I no longer wished to leave. He tried still to warn me. A blind man, a cripple, 20 years older, what could I want at his side? I said I was now rich and independent and my own mistress, and I would stay because I wished it so. If he would not marry me, I would simply move in as his nurse. Then he laughed for the first time again. Reader, I married him. It was a quiet wedding. He and I, the clergyman and the clerk, no more were in the church. We have lived ever since at Ferndean, and I have become his eye and his right hand. I read aloud to him, I guide him, we talk the whole day, and what I see, he sees through me. Diana and Mary married good men and come to us every year. St. John went alone to India and works there, unmarried, toward his end, which he does not fear. And my Edward? After 2 years, a glimmer of light returned to one eye, enough not to walk entirely in the dark anymore. And when his first son was laid in his arms, he could see that the boy had his eyes as they once were. I have now been married 10 years and know what it means to live wholly for and with one person. I hold myself blessed beyond all words, for I am my husband's life, as he is mine. No one could be nearer to another, flesh of his flesh, soul of his soul. That was our short retelling of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. A child no one wanted becomes a woman who stays true to herself through cold houses, a great happiness, and an even greater loss, until love calls her and she follows it of her own free will. Whoever does not lose themselves loses nothing in the end. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.